All right. So the last two activities have intentionally been individualistic. You've looked at yourself and how you communicate. In this presentation that I'm about to give for you, or the video, whatever, I want to talk a little bit about what I've seen looking through your stuff, and then how that fits into this bigger picture of what interpersonal communication is and how it's changing with all our modern media tools. Okay, so what you've found really, or what I've seen from reading, grading the last your communication log, and then the networks that you've created out of it, is that right now most everything is at distance. We know why that is, really, right? It's COVID. But one of the things that strikes me about that is that when we're only communicating at distance, we can do things like what I'm doing right now, which is extend our reach across time and space, much more so than when we're face to face. Although we do that at an expense, and we'll talk about that later. And then in your comm network, what I really noticed and what stood out was that each of us uses different sets of tools in different contexts of our lives. So depending on what we're doing, we'll use different tools to enhance our communication. That might be a YouTube video like this. That might be my eyeglasses when I'm out riding bikes with friends. Doesn't matter what it is, but I use a different set of tools for different contexts. Okay, so that's kind of the takeaways I saw from looking through everybody's stuff. But let's fit that into a bigger model of communication or interpersonal communication. And the first thing I want to talk about is the transactional model of communication, which I did share a video, kind of a boring video on that about. So I want to just go over that, okay? The transactional model of communication basically says that when we interact, when we exchange or information, when we communicate, that we converge. There's this idea of convergence. It's transactional. We give and take in that relationship, that communicative relationship, and that will eventually come to share meanings across words or word use. Okay, so words are symbols, and so what this means is that as we exchange information about these symbols, we come to have the same meaning about them. And so that's kind of the transactional model. Okay, but what that provides for us is this ability to define a base, or to conceive of a base communication unit, much like we could conceive of elements or molecules in the physical world around, making up the physical world around us. This base communication unit is sort of the fundamental exchange in order to define communication in our worlds. And so what that unit looks like is, I send out something to you. I speak to you. I draw you a picture. I do a hand signal. I do something, okay? Information goes out. There's a lot of stuff that could happen to that information in between there. We'll talk about that in a minute, maybe. But you eventually receive that information. You digest it, right? So you have one step, send it out to you. You digest it, or encode it is what that last slide would call it. But you internalize it, that information, and you come up with meaning with that. And then you give me some sort of signal back that says, oh, this is what I thought of what you just said. Okay, so that's sort of the third step. And then the fourth-ish step is that I receive that signal and I change as a result of it. I, the sender, send out a signal, you do something with it, I get some information back, and then I make change. There's internal change on my part that maybe tells me, oh, what I'm explaining doesn't really make sense, so let me explain it in a new way. All right, there's a verbal filler for you, that right I just threw out. So communication is this base unit of send out a signal, receive a signal, something receives a signal, gives information back, and then I change. After I've changed, that completes that base unit. So that's why I have in this slide this big bold idea that communication is about change. This gets important here in just a second. Okay, so this class is about interpersonal communication, but really we live in a life of a world of all different kinds of communication. This idea of interpersonal on one side and broadcast on another is just a lens to look at how we take in information about the external world, internalize it, and make meaning of it. Okay, that's what kind of communication is the symbolic transfer of energy. Okay, so it's communication, simply defined as how we make meaning of the external world around us. Okay, and it's really the signals we get from that external world that we make meaning from. That's what communication is. And one lens of defining that is interpersonal on one side and broadcast on the other. Interpersonal, going back to that base unit of communication, is when there's really fast exchange between the sender and the receiver, and that fast exchange, and so that the change on the sender's part happens really quickly. And then that creates things like, I don't know if you've ever been around in a group of people, like on a camping trip, and you don't really know anybody in the beginning, but by the end of the camping trip, you all kind of share the same slang words. That's that type of convergence, that rapid completion of the base communication unit that allows both the sender and the receiver, because if you think about it, once I send something, when you receive it and then give me something back, you're the sender in a new base communication unit. And so that rapid exchange of that cycle, traditionally in small, physically close units of not very many people, kind of defines interpersonal communication, and it creates things like shared slang. Okay. Broadcast communication sits on the other side of that, and that's a little bit more like what we're doing right now, where I'm sending this out without any feedback from you for quite some time. I'll get feedback from you from this when you start emailing me questions about the activity that I'll introduce at the end, or when I start seeing the results of the activity that you do, or when we have a meeting. Okay, so it's a slow unit. Like I send it out to all 24 of you, right? And then I don't get it back for a while. And then it takes me a little while to adapt and change to what you all need. So it takes a little longer. That's why in the very beginning, first week of this class, I sent out a lot of emails, because I was trying to complete that unit quickly right off the bat to get a feel for how you all interacted through these digital means that we're kind of stuck with now that there's COVID. Okay, so we have interpersonal and broadcast communication on the sort of the spectrums, and those are defined by essentially the rate at which the base communication unit is completed. And the last thing I haven't explained is, well, the rate, the size of the group that you're able to do that with, and then to some extent, the physical closeness of that group. Okay, so broadcast interpersonal, Let's go one step further. Oh, and wow, our phones and the internet, have they ever changed things, right? And all the applications that go on those devices. So digital communication in general, um, that has allowed us, social media has allowed us to really speed up the rate of the base communication unit across bigger distances and in bigger groups of people than we've ever had before. So it's mixing up this idea of interpersonal and broadcast communication and blending it. And we're going to be doing that all semester long in how we use different communication tools to interact with each other. Like right now, it's going to be this recording and Google Documents. Later on, we'll have Zoom meetings. There'll be a wide mix of how we do it. Maybe we'll interact just through Twitter for a little while to see how that plays out with this idea of interpersonal communication and presenting ourselves to the world. Okay, so real world check here is if you go back and look at your communication log and your learning network or your communication network, you'll hear me use those interchangeably. This is a bit of an aside. I see communication and learning as the same thing. Communication is the mechanism through which we learn. It's that change that happens in the base communication unit that defines learning. So that's why I sometimes interchange communication and learning. But so in your personal learning network, communication network, and in your communication log, if you go back and look at your tools, the tools you use to communicate, and think about now, okay, how does that tool enhance or slow down? Well, how does that tool play with the idea of physical distance and time and the size of the audience that you're interacting with, and particularly the speed at which you're able to complete that base communication unit? So if you're using tools that allow you rapid back and forth exchanges, texting, talking on FaceTime or Zoom, right? You don't have the full richness of a face-to-face conversation because all the other sensory information besides sight and sound is not being shared between the parties. But you do have the ability with sight and sound to complete that base communication unit really quickly. And that means you're going to be able to converge with whoever you're interacting with through those tools quicker than, say, if you're using tools that are much slower like YouTube, right? So just go back and check your tool use and see if that's true. Is that what you find in your real world? Okay, so that's kind of the lecture part of this video, and now I just really quickly want to cover the activity, which is your first graded speech. Okay, so the topic for your first graded speech is an aspect of your personal learning or communication network that has changed since COVID and how you see it evolving in the next year. So one thing for me is I used to teach face-to-face all the time. Honestly, in the next year, I don't see myself doing that regardless of what happens with the vaccine or anything like that. I think that education is going to fundamentally change in the future. So I will probably, the delivery of education. So if I had this speech to give, I would probably give a speech about that, starting from how my practice of teaching is changing, then sort of expanding into how that, why that is in a broader sense of the world, why I'm probably not the only one that's going to have to deal with that. Okay, So that's the topic for your first speech, an aspect of your personal communication network that has changed since COVID, and how you see that evolving over the next year. Okay, in that speech, it needs to be 4 to 5 minutes long, more like 5, could be 6, but please don't let it be 7. And if it's 3, that's way too short. Okay, and it needs to identify an aspect of your communication network that has changed as a result of COVID. Discuss how you think it will change again as we start to recover from COVID. So what that means is, point 1 there is saying, like, I used to teach face-to-face. In the future, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. It'll probably be some hybrid version. And then 3, detail the potential advantages and disadvantages you think to this change. Okay, so for me, that might be some of the advantages might be I can reach more students, particularly students in rural Alaska. Some of the disadvantages is that I'm not sure about the richness of that face-to-face conversation when we can be in the same classroom. So that's sort of the disadvantages. Now go check out the videos I've made on organization, presentation, validity, and peer reviewing to learn more about this assignment. And you'll see how some of that example I just gave about teaching online hybrid versus face-to-face could fit into the organization that you need to do for this speech, as well as some presentation techniques. Okay, please email me as always at rehum@alaska.edu with any kind of questions or thoughts.